Hi, everyone. Welcome to Off the Podium. My next guest is Mark O'Connor. Mark, welcome to Off the Podium.
Great. Good to be with you. Thanks.
I've been talking about this with a couple of my guests recently, and I don't like to talk about politics or any of current events, but with the current situation, everything that's happening around the world, it makes me think about music and classical music and everything that you're doing. How is this affecting you and negatively for the world of music? And what can we do as artists, and what will happen in the future that might even have a positive effect on everything that's happening?
Yeah, well, this is obviously a dreadful crisis that's hit our country in the U.S., but all over the world. Thinking in terms of the U.S., I've always been under the belief that music is a really great healer in times of crisis. And then, today we're forced to think that maybe it's impossible, at least right now, to have live performance of music to really see through that healing potential. Like people coming together and sharing something, and stepping out of their own daily crisis around music and the arts. Now, of course, music is not expendable. A lot of people are getting their music online through their favorite recordings. So, music is essential in that term, but it's obvious that live performance is pretty much last on the list as far as essential workers. And that's really hard to come to terms with. Of course, that's how the bulk of how I make my living is concert performing. Got a group, I've got a duo with my wife, Maggie, and also, orchestras here and there as well. But so it's really, when it first hit, of course, most of the musicians were thinking, well, this is probably going to be a month and then we're back up. But I figured pretty early on that it was going to be through the summer, just because of, everybody's trying to get back online and just nervous and scared to be in public. But now now it's obvious that it's going to continue for months, if not over a year more.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really quite scary.
Yeah. And this is also affecting, possibly might affect your big youth project that you have with the camp that you have, which is beneficial to thousands of youth. Have you decided if you're going to cancel that, and what's the next step with that?
Well, we've been talking about it, and we haven't made a formal decision. But I think the decision in my mind is that it's going to have to be canceled. What I was waiting to do as far as a formal announcement is to see if we could transition to something that was online, like a virtual camp, maybe through Zoom or something like that, but try to salvage that week, maybe get some guest teachers to do, private Skype lessons, and they can set up those appointments with the people that have already registered. But I'd have to reach out to our registrants so far. Of course, registration pretty much went downhill about a month ago. But the ones that have already registered, we haven't had any cancellations except one. So that was kind of interesting. I mean, I think people are hanging on, trying to figure out what's next. So I wanted to interview some of our faculty to see if we could put together a week of virtual teaching. Some of it could be in a seminar that maybe I could conduct, and then some other kind of private teaching through Skype. So there's something that good that can come out of that week in July.
And so you're passionate about the O'Connor method, which is so fantastic to see that a world-class musician with, Grammy awards and all these different awards and accomplishments thinks about the youth, because one thing that sometimes can be frustrating a little bit with some of these top artists not really getting involved with the youth, and it's great to see you're involved with the youth. Why is the American string playing, as you've talked about in previous interviews, and American classical music important, and what is the OConnor method all about, for those who don't know?
The camps now are really centered around the OConnor method. I started my string camps 25 years ago. They were, more loosely constructed, and it was really fun and kind of a free-for-all, all kinds of different players and styles. And over that period of time, I've honed this idea into an approach. And I realized that I really benefited from that approach, which was, for coming up in music in the 60s and 70s, was kind of frowned upon from a lot of different circles, where it was the age of specialization. And it's like, if you're gonna be anybody that was accomplished, then you need to pick one thing and stay in that lane. And I kind of proved in my career that doing a variety of things. For instance, I was just realizing I had just released an album, a reissue, called False Dawn, and I'm really excited about it because it had been out of print for 30 years. I just released it on iTunes and Spotify, all the digital platforms, called False Dawn. I recorded when I was 19, and it's all acoustic music, and it's very progressive and forward-thinking. And it was at the time where I was playing in an electric band called the Dregs, and so if you can kind of, some of you can kind of go back to that time, most of the time people were saying you either are an acoustic musician or an electric musician. Like, you can't do both, and both are completely two different approaches and training and culture and all this stuff. And I was doing both.
Yeah.
And I was doing it at the top of my game,
Yeah.
So that's just one aspect of how I think about an American school of string playing, where if you look at it on its face, it has to be full of diversity, because that's who we are.
Yeah.
It's not one style or one culture and one strain from violin. It's really a multicultural experience that involves European music, it involves Mexican and Hispanic music, and Latin American music.
Yeah.
It involves a lot of African American music, and music from the Middle East and near Asia, and the Native American music experience too, which was in different times of our 400 years in this part of the hemisphere, was musically very collaborative. There was a lot of cross-pollination going on, and I realized that when Yo-Yo Ma came to my house in Nashville at that time, it was about 1994, to basically interview me about the music I was writing and playing. And I was telling him all about it with all kinds of enthusiasm, because here I was getting to tell, America's most well-known string player about American music, which he didn't really know that much about. And I thought, what a great opportunity to impart all the things that have really inspired me in my music and career. And so I was talking about the importance of African American music and the spirituals and the blues and the ragtime, and how this fused with some European styles, maybe from the Celtic regions and so forth. And after about an hour or two of it explaining, and lots of questions that he had, very, very curious about what it all was. And one of the biggest questions at the end of our little session there in my kitchen was, is it important? And I realized how important it was. And the best I could, I told him it could be the most important musical approach easily of the last 100 years.
Yeah.
And when you look at that on that scale, on that level, then realize that, the youth of our country going to private studios or classrooms or even the conservatory are missing out on perhaps the most important string playing in the last 100 years is quite remarkable.
Yeah.
And that's what set me on pace to do even more research on the things that I knew and loved so much. And the OConnor method and the New American School of String Playing is the result of that.
Another thing that is really interesting to me with your approach as well is that the improvisation aspect. And I've told this story a couple of times, but for one of my youth orchestras, I invited, a non-classical, I guess, artist, Andrew Jocelyn. He came, he's a violinist, he came and played, and we tried a few things with some of my youth orchestra members. And what was the most interesting thing about that was that some of the younger players who were 9 and 10 picked up on improvisation and really didn't care too much about what other people were thinking. They were just going for it and maybe playing some wrong notes, if there is such a thing as wrong notes, and just kind of having fun. And the ones that I thought might do better, the 17 and 18-year-olds, were just struggling. They were just like, do you want me to play that note? Do you want me to play that rhythm? And so, it made me realize that it's so good to get them started young on, especially improvisation, but it's never too late. Your thoughts on improvisation and how was your early approach to improvising?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that I started to improvise quite a bit when I was 11 and 12. And by the time I was 12 and 13, I was improvising on stage, not entirely, but I was introducing it, and by the time I was 14, I was improvising a lot. And I could play jazz tunes and improvise and take off on them. So I think that's one really important aspect of the American school, because it's tied into the creativity, and the literature leaps out at you for changing the music. So while there's wonderful literature written, the music itself is open for interpretation, which I think is really the genius part of this whole thing. It's like none of these pieces are finished. They're not finished masterpieces. They can become masterpieces according to the performing artist and what they want to do with it. And I love that, because American music is about the musician, and that involves a lot more people than just a few master composers who get to make it all the way to the top. And I love that idea. Now, you can improvise on some classical music or early classical music, or maybe even Bach. I mean, I've done some of that. It's for the connoisseur. I mean, it's for the very top level of performing, and not many people are going to be there, and there's not going to be much of an audience for that anyway. It's much better to improvise on American materials that were really set up to have that kind of open door into a journey that each era kind of adds to the piece. And even in American classical music, some of the most successful American classical composers knew this inherently, like Gershwin. Gershwin composes a finished piece that, by all standards could be categorized as a masterpiece. But because it's an American approach, his music can be changed. Say take one of his songs, like say Summertime. How many different ways have we heard that song performed over the years? I mean, hundreds. And each time it's different, it's a little different, it's unique, but it still sounds like Summertime, and it still sounds like Gershwin. And I think that's the genius part of this American music approach. And kids, people of all ages, all levels, can experience that thrill of being in a creative environment on their solo instrument.
You talked a little bit about that, but your contributions as a composer, you've written 9 concertos, maybe more now, I'm not sure, but I read about 9. And the last one, from what I remember, I think it's the last one, is the Improvised Violin Concerto. What was your approach to that? Like, what was the form? How did the musicians know when to play, how to play? If you could give us some insight about how that was put together.
Well, began my concerto journey 25 years ago with the fiddle concerto. Mm-hmm. And it was such a unique concept. I mean, people couldn't even believe that I came up with a title with both words fiddle and concerto in the same line. But it's ended up being my most performed concerto, and more performances than any other modernly written concerto. Mm-hmm. And so after all these kind of pieces through doubles, I did a double violin concerto that I composed for Nacho Salerno Sonnenberg, and we recorded it and played it dozens of times. One of my most critically reviewed concertos, my American Seasons. Mm-hmm. So I've had a lot of really wonderful moments. And then I came to number 9, and I went, wow, that's kind of an interesting number for, big symphonic pieces. And I thought, I want to make it as unique as the first one, but what could that be, And I thought about it for like a year. I was considering a couple of other ideas. I was considering doing a viola concerto, by the way, instead. And I thought, that's kind of unique because there's not many viola concertos. And that might be a nice way to end it. I had just composed my violin and cello double concerto. And then I got this idea. It's like, is it possible? And then I started to create a context for it, using the faith movement to conclude the essential elements, kind of the intervention of the human capacity on earth. And therefore the theme of the piece kind of started to write itself, because one of the things that improvisers know is that it's much easier to make a bigger statement when there's a strong theme behind it. That's why a lot of the jazz improvisers, who are widely recognized as some of the best improvisers in the world, they usually choose well-known, or they did. I mean, this is how it all started. They chose well-known classic songs mm-hmm. to improvise and riff on, And so I wanted to create that kind of really strong foundation, not just completely esoteric, but something that had its own journey. And so I put, kind of the pieces together. It starts with fire, then air, then water, then earth. And conceptually as well, I wanted to toggle in between the acoustic nature of the violin and how it goes electric. And I love the idea that acoustic violins can simply be plugged in with a bridge pickup. You don't have to have one of those shiny objects that has a that's painted pink or something to have an electric violin sound. And that's one of the greatest things about the violin, is its incredible flexibility. You don't have to have a whole arsenal of different violins to capture the range of the instrument. You can, with the flick of the bow, or in this case, just, putting a volume pedal on, and you can create opportunities that the electric violin has, where it can rise in volume to match the fortissimo of the brass and the orchestra playing at tutti. Yeah. And so that opportunity is ultimately what improvisation is. Is choosing when you want to join in or lay out. And most of the standard procedure for concerto writing is that the solo violinist lays out during the tuttis because it's just too loud and you wouldn't hear the violin. But in this case, with the improvised violin concerto, as I compose the tutti sections and it rises in volume, I can join by pressing on the pedals all of a sudden. And then when it comes back down to piano or mezzo piano for a kind of an accompaniment volume, if you would, then I can take the electronics off and go back to the acoustic violin with the flip of the switch or the flick of the bow. And the entire piece is improvised from the solo. So it's 40 minutes and hundreds of chords and all kinds of meter changes. So there's quite a roadmap to follow. Yeah. Sometimes when people ask me, about improvising on the violin, they say, well, you just have to let your hair down, right? You just have to relax. I go, well, I don't know. Like, there's a lot to keep track of. If there's hundreds of chords and there's meter changes, you don't want to let your hair down too far. You get lost and you don't know where you are. So you have to, so in reality, your mind is just working like, times 10, because you're thinking about so many aspects of it. Do I play here? Do I play faster? Do I play slower? Do I change the context? And do I, and in this case, do I put the effects on right now, or make it acoustic and last longer before I do that? And all that's happening while you're improvising. So there's a lot to keep track of. And then of course you're listening to the orchestra and you're playing off the music that you've written for them. And you have a dialogue with the conductor. In this case, I asked the conductor to conduct as if it was a symphony, as if I wasn't there, but react to me after I do it.
Wow. Okay.
But don't look for me. Just respond. Like if I'm like really getting into some kind of idea, then you can respond to it. But basically, you have to conduct as if it was a standalone symphony, because I could disappear for a couple minutes. I mean, if it was truly improvised, I could lay out for a while and just let the orchestra play. And I do that, and it's just random times.
Wow. Well, going back to what you said about viola, I really hope you at some point compose a viola concerto. I'm sure a lot of violists would be very excited to get that from you. But advice to young fiddlers, advice to young musicians making a career in music. It's not always easy, but especially hard for a jazz violinist or a non-classical violinist or fiddlers to make it in the world. So what advice would you give them based on your career?
Speaking about career is really tough right now. It was made a lot tougher when the recording industry started going south. There was a real method to becoming successful as a musician. I mean, it wasn't fair necessarily to everyone because there was opportunities that were not given. There was a method and a roadmap, and you kind of knew where you were along the way. Like if you could get a manager, if you could get an agent, if you could get signed to a label. Those are benchmarks that tell you, okay, I'm going in the right direction. I have a chance at this. I mean, you still might not make it, but at least you have an opportunity to put yourself out there, see what comes of it. And I had those opportunities. Today, before the COVID-19 crisis, it was less of a methodology. And I think part of it is that, just the weakening of record labels. My older record label, Sony Classical, where I released, Appalachian Waltz and Appalachian Journey and other CDs. I sold millions of albums there, which is pretty incredible to think about, being a violinist and a kind of an artsy composer. Yeah, sure. There was a couple of things we did with James Taylor and Alison Krauss, but for the most part, it was mostly instrumental music. So that was one of the things that stuck out to me that really helped, is that an occasional collaboration with a vocalist. Keep in mind that the violin and viola and cello are such a great companion sound and interpretation for songs. And we've known that. American music has known that for hundreds of years. That's why most, quote, fiddle tunes, some of the very fiddle tunes or songs or folk songs or spirituals or blues, the things that are in my method books, all of the traditional ones have lyrics. So you think of, an old fiddle tunes like Soldier's Joy or Orchestra Traveler, they have lyrics. There were songs. That's one of the strengths, I think, that the American scene can bring a string player, is that sense of collaboration outside your own genre, where you can bring the string instrument into a band or into a setting that's mostly about the vocal potentially, but you can add something of your instrument to it. And of course, I made a living doing that for years as a session player, played on, hundreds and hundreds, 500 albums, loaning, my sound to another artist's songs.
Yeah.
And so that's a big deal. I think that I always want to support the orchestra and the string orchestras, symphony orchestra, chamber orchestra. And, I continually hope that there's going to always be philanthropy and funding for this very special performance art, because there's nothing like it. There's nothing in the world that can sound as beautiful and striking as 50 string players, 75, 100. I mean, it's just really an amazing thing that we have to hold on to. And that's why I've composed a lot of music for string orchestra and symphony orchestra. So I'm trying to do my part in upholding that beautiful art form.
Well, this is changing gears a little bit, but your fans, people who followed your career over the decades, know so many different things about you. Is there something that you're willing to share with us that they don't know, that's possibly a hobby that not many people know, or just something about you that most people might not know?
About 20 years ago, maybe 23 or 4 years ago now, I developed bursitis and tendonitis in my right arm.
Wow.
And it was mainly from guitar playing. I grew up in Mount Lake Terrace, born in Seattle, grew up in Mount Lake Terrace right next to Linwood, where my grandmother lived, and my grandmother homesteaded. She settled Linwood. If she would have kept to her land, my grandparents, they would have had all of Linwood. But they gave the parcels away as they wanted neighbors. People were coming and homesteading, settling out west. This was all in the early 1900s.
Wow.
And my grandmother, she was born in Memphis in 1883, and I knew her. She was old when I was young, but I got to know her. And I grew up in Mount Lake Terrace and Seattle, training on guitar as well. So it's a very, very special instrument to me. And when I developed bursitis, and it basically just, took me out of commission for a month or two, I couldn't even move my arm. And then the docs were basically saying, well, whatever, you got to figure out what gave you that condition and just do less of it. And so in the hopes of rescuing my ability to play the violin, I just quit all the other instruments.
Wow.
I just thought they're going to have to sacrifice for the one. And then 20 years go by, and I put the band together with my wife and my son Forrest and my daughter-in-law Kate, called the Mark O'Connor Band. And I started getting the inkling to try to play a little guitar again and play a little mandolin again. It's so weird. Like after a couple of years of practicing, I'm not going overboard, but I'm putting together new arrangements and practicing and things. I feel like I'm better now at guitar than I left off at the time I got the injury. So I think music can always provide for some really wonderful creative surprises. And I think creative musicians always have something that could be up their sleeve, just around the corner, and to open yourself up to experimenting. Because, most of the stuff that I've accomplished over the years, if I had listened only to advisors or management or record labels or any of the folks and entities that I really hope to establish a relationship with, I wanted them to be in my music career, because I not only wanted them, but I wanted them to, so I could grow, but I could also wanted them because I wanted to have a career. But if I would have only listened to them and in their advice, I wouldn't have tried 75% of the things that I've done in my musical life. And most of those things are my favorite things. And most of those things are the ones that put me on the map, believe it or not. It was the times where they said, you should stay away from that, or you can't do that. And those were the times where I dug in, I figured something out, and that resonated the most. And I can't tell you how many times that's happened like that. And the OConnor method really is something like that. I mean, it's, when you look at the violin education and you consider the great traditions, the Russian school and the Hungarian school, the French and the German, and and more recently the Japanese Suzuki school. A critic could say, well, it's pretty much covered. I mean, what could you do that they didn't do? And to be a real artist with ideas that you want to see through, you have to kind of shut some of that stuff out and say, well, there is a lot that I could do. I've got to believe in myself. So I think that's one of the secrets.
And I don't want to take too much of your time, but I have a couple more questions. One is, if we were to open your phone or your laptop and look at some of the recent albums you've been listening to, what would some of those composers or singers or artists be, or pieces or songs?
It's funny. My listening habits have really kind of more aligned with kind of everybody else. It's kind of interesting because as alternative as I am as an artist and a musician, you would think that I just listen to really, really weird stuff all the time, like things that nobody checks out, But actually, to give my life a little bit of balance, I don't mind checking out some of the pop groups and, just to see what people are listening to. And I enjoy some of it. And one of the things that I've really, really, I guess, celebrate, and because I'm 58 now, is really admiring that even in pop culture, how many of the older musicians, and sometimes much older, are still just tearing it up out there. I have to admire that, like people like Tony Bennett. And my teacher, Stéphane Grappelli, he was on stage. He was performing a concert at 89, just months before he died. And then my legendary fiddle teacher, Benny Thomasson, out of Texas, he actually died playing on stage.
Wow!
In his mid-70s, he fell back, and his son who was playing guitar caught him. And I went, man, that now there's the dream. Like, who thinks about retirement when you're a musician, and now we're in an age where you would think that because of all the online stuff and all the tech gadgets, that would be kind of a younger person's game now. But in reality, it's made a nice pathway for older legendary musicians to keep putting out, And I really like that about our music culture. It's we're recognizing the greats even when they get up there in their 70s and even 80s, and there's still room for them to perform. Yeah, so I don't mind checking out some of the older folks like Bennett and old friends in the different genres. I mean, James Taylor, he's still up until a month ago, he was touring about as much as he ever toured. It's kind of kind of crazy, isn't it? But yeah, I think part of it's like my mind is so, racing so much with new musical ideas. And like right now I'm working on a mandocello piece that I'm going to put up online probably in a couple days. This old 1924 mandocello, tuned like a cello, but a mandolin version of it. And it's just a gorgeous instrument. And so I'm like way deep into that arrangement right now and working on a bunch of other things. And then sometimes just for relaxation, I just want to listen to something really simple.
Well, the last question, but you've worked with some of the iconic, musicians, of 21st century, and you've recorded, you have written concertos. Is there something that you want to write? Is there some collaboration you would like to have that you just haven't had the opportunity or the time to do yet, and you really want to do?
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like I've gotten to do so many things in music, and I feel like part of me wants just to be open to just what happens, that I don't have necessarily any more goals specifically, but I'm always working on something. Like I've got the piano trios that I've composed, that I recorded a while back, that I want to edit and finish the production of. And that's going to surprise a lot of people. I composed, speaking one of the older artists that I admire, Johnny Cash, I composed a piano trio based on his life in music. And it's really interesting. It's called Poets and Prophets. I want to get that out. And I had mentioned, a minute ago about my guitar playing, and I keep coming up with new solo guitar arrangements. But I'll have to say, like, my wife, Maggie, is a wonderful partner. We met about 6 years ago, and we have just, we've just been playing, and I just love it. I would have never believed that I would have found a partner, a marital partner, that I would be working with in music like this. I mean, it was never a goal, never an aspiration. I wasn't looking, and assumed it just would not happen to someone like myself. And mainly because I'm such a, particular perfectionist, and, I don't know, it just seems like would be a bad mix. It would have to take someone just like Maggie that would allow me the space just to be me, I guess. And but she does, and she's such a really incredible American violinist and creative in her own right. And like for instance, just like literally yesterday or 2 days ago, we got this idea, because I still practice some of my old Texas fiddle tunes. A lot of people can't imagine that really, but that's sort of like my Bach. And I practice a little Bach too, but I sort of practice these old Tex fiddle tunes I learned from Benny Thomasson, the way they're structured, and I love it. They're like my practice pieces, But I play them basically by myself, and my wife Maggie was starting to pick up the cello more and more in our off time. And we got the idea that why doesn't she do like the bass line, play it like a bass, and accompany me on a Texas fiddle tune? And we did that for the first time 2 days ago. And things like that were so rewarding. I mean, so, it's some of it might be something I would have never had a goal to do, or, but it's just sort of like an accident. And I love that about my life now in music, and where is it going to take me? Because I have such a catalog behind me. That's the other thing. I'm not like itching to create my musical universe. It's kind of, a lot of it's out there. I've got 45 feature albums, the whole method book series that took me 10 years to author, incredible amount of compositions that, by the way, are online. You can download any of my scores or parts for my compositions, including all the string pieces, the trios, the duos, the solos, the quartets, all that stuff. Also, my method book series just went up digitally a few weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And so you can get that at sharmusic.com. They have the digital series and the physical series. So as well known as the OConnor method has been, it's been mainly used by American teachers, although some teachers from other countries, including Europe and Asia and Africa and South America, have used my method, but it's very difficult for the students to buy the materials because of shipping and duty. But now with the digital edition, it's out there. So I think at this point, I'm just like leaving myself open to interpretations. Like I'm kind of just responding to the moment. Yes, I had some goals, but having the family band with my son, that was not a goal. Yeah. I had never, ever thought of that. Like even when Forrest was getting good at his music in college, I had never thought of having a professional group with him until it happened. And it just kind of hit me and went, we should do that. And then my wife and Kate, and we won a Grammy together,
It's amazing. Yeah.
It is. Yeah. So I love leaving myself open for the interpretation of our time. And I feel like I've got such a catalog of music that makes me who I am. I don't feel threatened in any way by not having done enough yet.
Yeah. Well, we could go on and talk about your career and your collaborations with all the different artists, and maybe sometime in the future we could talk about some of the albums. The album Heroes. That's great, and all the other things that you've done. But I think it's good, and I'm gonna let you go. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it, Tigran.
Have a beautiful day.
You too.